So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today's episode is going to be an in-depth talk about affirmative action. If you like the stuff we do and want to see more, of course, subscribe, follow us on Spotify, follow us on all the social medias, keep up to date with our written articles on our website. But without further ado, I'm Akash Lush.
And I'm Jules Hunt.
And this is Mildly Interesting.
Mildly interesting. No, seriously, just mildly interesting.
Today's episode is going to follow a different structure from the usual episodes. Instead of talking about 3 news stories, we're going to talk about one story in depth, and that is affirmative action. Santos, do you know what affirmative action actually means?
Well, it was introduced to the Kennedy administration in the 1960s. It was suggested by an African-American lawyer, Hobart Taylor Jr. It's basically socially understood people don't want their racial or gender identities to be ignored, right? The way he came up with it was to sort of boost the way in which these unrepresented groups move in society. So it's to increase social mobility by these unrepresented groups. So it is really important now, especially just because in the US, where affirmative action is highly debated, an upcoming Supreme Court ruling may push the elite colleges and universities in America to embark on a more different kind of affirmative action, which we will get to further down the line. But this ruling, it's expected to pass at this point just because, obviously, with Donald Trump, most of the Supreme Court judges are right-wing leaning. And therefore, it's a very just expected action to just happen. Well, why don't you tell Zach, so how does it work, affirmative action? Because we've established what it is, what it's supposed to do, but how does it achieve that?
Like you said, it was introduced in the Kennedy administration by an executive order that John F. Kennedy signed, establishing that government contractors will take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and treated equally during the length of employment regardless of their race, creed, color, or national origin. When it first started out, affirmative action was just a phrase where companies that the government worked with would basically do their best to employ those who are qualified and of certain groups that are discriminated, and as a sort of good faith.
I don't know if you heard, it was really funny to me when Hobart Taylor was talking about why he called it affirmative action, how he came up with the name. He said that he did it just because it sounded good.
Yes, I remember. He said he liked the alliteration, right?
Yeah, he just liked how it sounded.
Yeah.
It just sounded good, so
yeah.
He just went with it.
In legal terms, what essentially it was just another vague US law, which they didn't have any distinct outlines on what companies should do. It was just the idea that they should do something. And for the longest time, that's what affirmative action was. It was just the idea that companies should be able to show that they do enough to employ those who are from minority backgrounds. And this extended to higher education institutions as well, so universities. In the mid-1960s, colleges and universities began to endorse racially attentive admission and recruitment programs. People note that black students were either more or less officially shut out in southern predominantly white colleges, and in the northern selective colleges were effectively mostly shut out. So obviously these universities recognize that this is not fair and is essentially a racial justice issue. And of course they wanted to be on the right side of racial justice.
The idea is that it considers race and ethnicity as part of a more holistic sort of like take in a more holistic method of taking in students. The idea behind it is that applications are still taken sort of like a more colorblind way. I saw a report that says that good faith efforts are made to include racial minorities. So in essence, and this somewhat seems wrong when you say it. In essence, it is the way to end discrimination is by discriminating.
There's actually a word for it. I think it's called positive discrimination, which is the most paradoxical phrase I've ever heard.
Now, tell me something, Akash, before we get into the sort of advantages and disadvantages of affirmative action when it comes to education, which where we'll be focusing on today. What do you think? What are your two cents on it? Do you agree with affirmative action? Do you think it's a needed thing? Do you think there's better ways to do it?
As far as I'm aware, with how it's evolved in the law over the years, essentially it is that race and gender and in some cases disability should be a factor in hiring people, but should not be the deciding factor. Obviously, I think the correct phrasing that I liked at least was that you should make sure that everyone has a seat on the table, but then obviously you don't want to reserve seats for specific people.
Let me rephrase the question then, because I think it's really hard not to agree with the idea behind affirmative action. The fact that certain groups of people are underrepresented in jobs, but in this specific case in education, is obviously a bad thing. And it shouldn't be there at all, or at least as pronounced as it is today. But is it working? It is a matter of a lot of contention in the US. There are studies that come from both sides, really, but sometimes it seems like it isn't.
It's still very vaguely worded, so the idea is it's up to individual institutions and companies on how they want to enforce it. And obviously, they have their own ways of doing that. A report by the Labor Department during Reagan's era, from 1974 to 1980, found that the rate of minority employment in businesses that contracted with the government rose by 20%, while in companies that did not contract with the government, the rates were only about 12%. Obviously, this was when affirmative action only applied to those that the government worked with. So you can look at reports like that and go, well, obviously it has an effect. But in universities and I guess higher education institutions, it's the sort of challenges that we've seen against affirmative action is based on the fact that they don't believe it's good faith enrollment. It's more of quota filling.
Just to make sure everyone understands this correctly, in the US, where we are basing most of our research, in the US it's illegal, downright illegal to have quotas.
Yes.
In education. I'll give my point straight away is that I don't agree with affirmative action as it is now. I do think it's doing more bad than good, but you will often come across people that say this argument and base the argument on the fact that it's quotas. But quotas are downright illegal in the US. They don't exist in education.
I think there are two cases brought up against higher education institutions that kind of highlight the difference between affirmative action and quotas. So in 1997, there were two cases. There was Gratz v. Bollinger and Grutter v. Bollinger, which were white students at the University of Michigan challenging the use of race in the admissions process. So the undergraduate program failed strict scrutiny because it was believed that some spots on the undergraduate program were being reserved for sort of racial minorities and other discriminated people. So that fully was quota filling. That was the campuses going, we need X amount of racial minorities, get them in, like enroll them no matter what. However, the law school program survived because they did it in the right way, in which race was a factor among a multiplicity of other factors, and it was not the determining factor. So obviously, this is the difference, but I think, like you said, in its current form, affirmative action, it doesn't help as much as it could, I believe.
Like some of the studies that I've found suggest that it doesn't even help whatsoever. Because even if race is not the determining factor, if you give it enough weight, it will become a factor that should not be as powerful as it is. And before we get into how it could change, why don't you sort of like walk us through the sort of like advantages of affirmative action, or at least what we perceive are the advantages of affirmative action?
Obviously, the idea behind it and one of the proposed sort of advantages, I guess you could say, of this program is the idea of attempting to right the wrong of sort of segregation and discrimination, like the decades of history of it in America. Decades of segregation and exclusion from opportunities has led to certain groups being more financially underprivileged, let's say, and having less social status. So affirmative action was a way of sort of undoing this, where we give opportunities and financial resources back to those discriminated groups and thus kind of uplift them in order for them to be seen as equals with in a predominantly white sort of controlled society.
And it also like encourages them to pursue education, because a lot of these groups just this because they believe that inherently they will have a foot out the door. They have decided not to pursue education, and affirmative action is supposed to encourage you
exactly
to pursue higher education.
Yeah, from a symbolic standpoint, it should in essence be a motivating force that has all sort of races, all creeds, all sort of different disabilities and abled people believe that they all have equal chances with each other of getting into, say, university or getting into a job, as long as they are qualified.
You touched on a very good point there, which is qualification. And when you talk about qualification in affirmative action, you kind of get a paradox, don't you? Because race itself is not a qualification. It kind of takes away from the sort of like meritocracy aspects that you expect from education.
There's also the kind of idea that obviously, and this is a very touchy subject, obviously we're handling this as sensitive as possible, but it's the idea that white Americans who historically are privileged and have it, like, have not been discriminated against, essentially they lose out under affirmative action. It's the idea that obviously, there are not an infinite number of opportunities or resources, and that it's the concept that certain groups of people who are losing out on opportunities that they would have gotten, so to speak. If we go back to like the seat at the table analogy, some people's seats may get taken by other people when it wasn't going to be that way before.
Exactly. It's and I think anyone who thinks about this for at least 5 seconds can agree that having a sort of like racially integrated classrooms is a very good thing, and there's studies about it that conclude that it can like reduce students' racial bias, improve satisfaction, reduce prejudice, and all these things are obviously very good things and things we must consider and must have in education. But when you look into this a bit more, there are a varied set of disadvantages to affirmative action as it is now. And we've touched on meritocracy, and I want to touch on the idea of reverse discrimination.
We've touched on it a bit during the episode. It's essentially positive discrimination. It's the idea that, inherently, some groups are more likely to be discriminated against, so you put plans or regulations in place where, they are a bit more favored to give them, like, evil playing field.
Yeah, so that's pretty much the idea. It's just because some groups are not part of a minority group, then they are less likely to be given opportunities regardless of their talent. But the problem here is that you see, especially in America, a very big minority group that still gets disadvantaged by affirmative action, and that's Asian Americans. And this is often a common talking point in a lot of debates about affirmative action. It usually goes like, left says the right is bigoted, and the right says the left is stupid, and it just kind of stays that way. However, there are studies that suggest that black applicants who score worse than Asian Americans on entrance tests are equally likely to win a place, and this all comes from the idea that Asian Americans are renowned for their excellence of grades, right? And if you take this study into account, and there's multiple studies like this, then affirmative action just kind of seems to be doing the opposite that it does already, because Asian Americans are a minority group in the US. They are discriminated against. In this sense, they would be discriminated against in education by the very framework that is supposed to uplift them. What do you think about this? Do you think this is just a just a talking point that is just kind of right-wing nonsense?
Obviously, it just kind of circles back to the argument of sort of how much weight do you put on race when enrolling. And I believe that the framework that's been put in right now is not up to par. It could be a lot better. Like, we understand that obviously we all support sort of the idea behind affirmative action, and the symbolism of it, it works fine, but the way it's implemented, it's a flip of a coin whether it's beneficial or not, depending on sort of where you are and how it's implemented. Because we have seen studies that show that it's not really working, or it's having the reverse effect, and we have studies showing that, like, students are being exploited for, like, their sort of racial identity. Like, campuses are trying to be cosmetically diverse, no matter what that means. So, like I said, it's like a flip of the coin, whether it's actually genuine, good faith enrollment, or if it's companies behind these higher education institutions trying to market themselves as diverse, or just trying to fill some quotas.
Because even if quotas are illegal, with the framework that you have today, it is possible to implement quotas without calling them quotas.
Like with everything in the American legal system, there are always loopholes. And, we have, like, under the table dealings we've seen before, people getting accepted into colleges just by, large donations of money from their parents or something. So it's not totally unheard of that institution administrations would have, unwritten rules about enrollment procedures.
I really like that you touched on the point of, donations and the aspect of money. So the whole idea behind this is that people who are disadvantaged will also be disadvantaged financially. However, if you look at Ivy League universities, because they are the main contender in this kind of debate, you can see that there's studies that suggest that those who get in Harvard, for instance, are already advantaged. In fact, 71% of the black and Latino students come from already wealthy backgrounds. So it seems that they are taking people from racial minorities, but they are taking people that are already advantaged financially, as opposed to what affirmative action is supposed to do. Don't you think?
Yeah, it does seem like it's still very much a status issue and like a class issue around certain institutions.
Yeah, because there are many reports, and when I was researching for this episode, I found many of them that suggest that, for instance, Black and Latin American students are, even now, after affirmative action has been in for decades, more underrepresented at selective universities, so that's Ivy League universities, than they were 35 years ago. Even though the fact that the poverty rate in these groups has decreased since 1970, it is still more than double the rate for white Americans. So I think this just shows the underlying problem with this. The underlying problem is not necessarily race, in my opinion. The underlying problem is the financial disparities between minority groups, which obviously take into account race, but it's the financial problems that take into account. So that kind of plays into my next question. Do you think that affirmative action, instead of being done by race, should be done based on class?
Yes. I do believe that, obviously I don't believe that we are in a equal society just yet. Obviously there's still deep-rooted racial and discriminative tones in societies, especially like America, which was essentially built on discrimination. But I do believe we've left out an important factor, which is inherent resources given where you come from or given your family background. It's interesting to me that affirmative action was implemented with the idea of giving sort of discriminated groups a leg up, but what we see today is still essentially that those specific outliers where discriminative groups come from an advantaged place or a privileged place, it is those ones getting the opportunity, and we still have sort of a heavy portion of the overlooked groups still being denied opportunities. So I do believe, like, obviously your ethnicity and race should be somewhat of a factor, but it should also be counterweighted, or I guess weighed the same as your social standing, I guess, your economic standing.
I don't necessarily agree with the fact that race should be taken into account when it comes to education, at the very least. I do think, and this is my personal opinion, and unless there are studies that counteract that, and there might as well be in the near future with the Supreme Court ruling that might come, I don't think race today should be taken into account when factoring in applications. I do 100% think that class should be taken into account. And if class is taken into account, then those disadvantaged groups will automatically have a leg up, right? Because the idea is that if you don't have the resources to get to the place where you might even need or be able to apply for Ivy League schools, then affirmative action does nothing. Because if you can't get there, there's no way you're going through. And this is an idea that was discussed during the civil rights movement, where Martin Luther King said that this sort of idea, a race-based idea, and he did talk about class a lot, would disproportionately benefit black people because they formed the vast majority of America's disadvantage, or they did at the time, and at the same time it was not appropriate for poor white people. And in now this case, for poor people in general. MLK was one of the biggest spokesperson at the time for affirmative action on a class basis. But I do think there's also merit to people who say that maybe affirmative action should just be gone, and instead we should focus on boosting people from the ground up. Have you ever heard of ASAP?
I don't think I've come across it.
So ASAP is this organization which is meant to give students financial help. So this includes money for textbooks and sort of like free metro cards to sort of like go around the city. They have career advisors who the students must meet several times a month. They are tracked by data operation, which is sort of like detects students that are in precarious positions before, they end up quitting university. And it just supports students that way to allow them to succeed in education. And this is a great organization I came across, but I do think it should be further than that. I think you should start financing students and helping students when they're young, because you want to ensure that minority students get to the point that they can apply for Ivy League universities. They have the merit necessary, because the last thing you want to see is students getting into university, and I'm talking about disadvantaged students getting into university, not because they had the grades for it, but because of the race. And because of that, they feel out of place, and they end up quitting in 2 months' time, 1 year time, 2 years' time, right? That's the last thing you want to see. You want to support them from the ground up so that they can get to the point where they belong in that university, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of their ethnic background. What do you think, Akash? Do you think this is like the idea of abolishing affirmative action and instead focusing on boosting people from the ground up, and perhaps even further from when they were young, to the point where they eventually go into university? Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think that's better than affirmative action as we have now?
I'm not sure I would want to say better than affirmative action, but it's definitely more well thought out and more planned. So I guess in a sense it is better. But yeah, it does sound more well thought out and more planned because it's based on, like you said, pretty much the foundations of whether you have the resources or the social status to go for these opportunities. And since it's based on that, I think it's a lot more uplifting than affirmative action, which is, it doesn't really do anything. Essentially, it just says, it's all based on good faith.
Yeah, if you can have, obviously nothing against wealthy people going into Ivy League universities, but if your whole argument stands behind the idea that anyone from any background can get into Harvard, for instance, but then the statistics show that more than 70% of your students who are black, who are from a disadvantaged minority group, are already wealthy. So you're basically giving places to people that would have them regardless of affirmative action. What are your sort of like closing thoughts on this, Akash? What do you think should happen from now? Where do you see it going, and how do you want it to go?
So, I do believe we do need something like this, something that uplifts those who are in a disadvantaged place and who gives them the opportunities or the resources in order to go for essentially, live the American dream. You chase your dreams. As long as you work hard, you can make it. Some people just need help because of factors that they can't control, limiting that possibility. So I do believe we need something more well thought out and more sort of well implemented than just a line in the law saying that institutions should, factor race into enrollment. I think the Supreme Court again and again has kind of said that this law has, a time limit on it. Like, after a while we won't need it. And I believe it's time to start reviewing if we need to, take the next step and actually do something about it.
Where do you think it's going then? Where do you want it to go?
Obviously, I don't want it to just be repealed and nothing to be done. Hopefully, what I'm hoping for is that it is kind of looked at, examined, and each institution agrees that, no one should be discriminated against based on race, gender, ability. But at the same time, I believe that it should give way, essentially, to programs like ASAP, where actual work is being done to uplift those who are discriminated against. So hopefully, I would like to see a sort of change in the spotlight from affirmative action to programs such as that are actually doing something.
Yeah, I think we agree with each other here. I do understand that you still think that race should be taken into account, right?
Yes, I guess, because race does have a sort of say in, race is a factor in whether you are sort of, I guess, disadvantaged socially or not, especially in, countries like America where there is deep-rooted discrimination. I don't believe it should be, the deciding or the most important factor, but if we look at, those who would need programs like ASAP, statistically speaking, they are more likely to come from one of these minority groups.
In my opinion, I disagree with the fact that race should be there at all. Now, that would be in a perfect world. I'm aware we don't live in a perfect world. So I think that affirmative action as it is now should not exist. I think that there are two better options, and that's affirmative action based on class, and affirmative action that simply doesn't exist, and instead there's another program that uplifts students from the ground up, from when they're young. Now, like you said, in America there are deep-rooted racial disparities that affect the financial life of people, minority groups. So I do think that for timing, at least, race should still be taken into account, but on a much lower scale than it is now, and instead it should definitely be taken into account. And instead, we should definitely take into account class and, sort of financial support and even social support, just support in general to minority groups and those who can't. And whether you're Black, Asian, white American, you should still be able to get that help if you're disadvantaged in that way.
Hopefully, like all other episodes, you were mildly interested by that. If you do like the stuff we do, obviously subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Spotify. Also, keep up to date with us on all our social media platforms, Instagram, Twitter. Even check out the website, mildly-interesting.co.uk. Santos actually posted an article about the Ukrainian crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we have more articles to come. But yeah, thank you for listening. I have been Akash Lush.
And I was Vincent.
And this was Mildly Interesting.
Mildly interesting. No, seriously, just mildly interesting.